Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If you're new to the show, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're about. Here on the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode, though, is a special one and a first for the Commander's Quarters. Today's deck tech is going to feature a super budget deck. So what do I mean by super budget? Well, typically we build our decks with a $25 budget that's $25 for 100 cards. However, with this deck, we're going to challenge ourselves even further by limiting our budget to only $15. Alright, enough about the rules of the show, let's get on with the show. Today's commander is going to be Zada, Hedron Grinder. Zada is a 3/3 goblin ally that costs 3 and a red. It has, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that only targets Zada, copy that spell for each other creature you control that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Zada is a really interesting commander because at first you might not know what to do with her. But once you start looking into it, there are a lot of cards that work really well with Zada. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we're going to get creatures out as quickly as possible and then target Zada with spells. Again, every single time we cast a spell that targets Zada only, it's going to copy for each creature that we control. So how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to have explosive turns that come out of nowhere. We can put out a lot of creatures and cast a ton of spells with this deck very quickly. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. Let's go into tactic number 1, quick start. We want to get creatures out as quickly as possible with this deck, so mana dorks come in huge. First off, we're running Hedron Crawler, Mannequin, and Milliken, each of which cost 2 and tap for a colorless. Then we have Ironmere, who taps for a red, and Plaguemere, who taps for a colorless. Plaguemere also has Infect, which can definitely kill some people with this deck. Then there's Wily Goblin, who isn't technically a mana dork, but he does give us a treasure when he comes into play. Next up is Opaline Unicorn, Alloy Mirror, and Scuttlemutt, each of which cost 3 and tap for 1 mana of any color. Finally, we're running Palladium Mirror, which costs 3 and taps for 2 colorless. Again, these mana dorks come in huge for this deck. They're an extra body for Zada's ability, and they help us cast our spells more quickly. Again, with this deck, we want to get as many creatures out as quickly as possible, so let's go through some more in tactic number 2, Swarm the board. Ornithopter is a 0/2 with flying, and it costs us nothing to get out. Then we've got Goblin Instigator and Mogwar Marshal, each of which will create a 1/1 red goblin token when they come into play. Mogwar Marshal also has an echo cost, but when it dies, it's going to give us another 1/1 goblin token. Whenever we go into combat with Zada on the battlefield, Loyal Apprentice will create a 1/1 Thopter with haste. And then there's Young Pyromancer, who has, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. We're going to cast a ton of instants and sorceries with this deck, so this guy comes in huge. Next up is Gyropore, Gearcrafter, and Thopter Engineer, both of which, when they come into play, will create a 1/1 Thopter. Thopter Engineer will also give all of our artifact creatures haste. Next up is Hanwar Garrison, and whenever it attacks, we're going to put 2 1/1 red human creature tokens onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. When Beetleback Chief enters the battlefield, we're going to create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens with it. Finally, we're running Siege Gang Commander, which when it comes into play will get 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and he also has pay 1 and a red, sacrifice a goblin, Siege Gang Commander deals 2 damage to any target. This can help us ping down any opponents with a low life total, and it can also help us take out any pesky creatures that we need to. Alright, so we've gone through some creatures that help us create a few tokens, but let's go through some spells that help us create even more. It's time to go into tactic number 3, Cheap Help. First up, we've got Kranko's Command and Dragon Fodder, each of which is going to create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Kuldotha Rebirth and Hordling Outburst both create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. With Kuldotha Rebirth, though, we will have to sacrifice an artifact to do so, but since it only costs 1, it's an amazing card in this deck. Then there's Thatcher Revolt, which will put 3 1/1 red human creature tokens with haste onto the battlefield, but we will have to sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Finally, we're running Empty the Warrens, which is a huge spell for this deck. Empty the Warrens is going to create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and it has Storm. We are going to be casting a ton of spells very quickly with this deck, so Empty the Wardens can create a ton of goblin tokens for us. So we've talked about these spells that help us create a lot of creature tokens, but there's some other spells that do it, but in some pretty interesting ways. Let's go through it in tactic number 4, Double the Fun. First up, there's Spawning Breath, which is going to deal 1 damage to target creature or player, and we get to put a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn token into play. Now at first, this card might seem pretty weak in a deck, but with Zada, this card is amazing. By targeting Zada with Spawning Breath, we're going to ping each one of our creatures for 1, but we're also going to create 1 colorless Eldrazi spawn token for every single creature we control. There are also plenty of cards in this deck that can help pump up our creatures' toughness so that they don't die when we cast Spawning Breath. If we are able to do this, then we essentially double the number of creatures that we control. Make Mischief does pretty much the exact same thing, but instead of an Eldrazi spawn, it's going to be a 1/1 red devil. And whenever that devil dies, it's going to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Then we have some of the best cards in this deck with Twin Flame and Heat Shimmer. When we cast either Twin Flame or Heat Shimmer and we target Zada, it's going to copy every single creature we control. Those creatures will exile at the end of the turn, but they do have haste, and they can help us copy other spells that we cast. Again, the goal of this deck is to get out a ton of creatures so that every single time we cast a spell at Zada, it copies for every single creature we control. Finally, we've got Otherworldly Outburst that has target creature gets +1/+0 until the end of the turn, and whenever that creature dies this turn, we're going to put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi token into play. This card is excellent in this deck in that it keeps the number of creatures that we have on the battlefield the same and might even give us some bigger creatures. So if someone wraths the board, we can respond with Otherworldly Outburst, and all of our creatures will basically turn into 3/2 Eldrazi. Alright, so we've talked about getting a ton of creatures on the board very quickly, and now that we're set up, let's go on to tactic number 5, same day delivery. One of the big complaints in Commander about mono red decks is that they don't have a lot of access to card draw. However, with Zada, we don't have that problem. Let me show you. When we target Zada with Crimson Wisp, Expedite, or Renegade tactics, we get to draw a card for each creature we control. Now these cards do have other effects like giving a creature haste, which does come in handy, but our main focus with these cards is drawing a ton of cards at once. Again, with this deck, we're going to be creating a ton of creatures, so just by casting one of these spells for just 1 red mana, we get to draw a ton of cards. It is incredible value. And then we've got Accelerate and Stun, which costs 2, but will draw us a card for each creature we control. Boiling Blood costs 3, and it will draw us a card for each creature we control, but it's going to make those creatures attack if they're able, so we're going to have to cast it either after our combat phase or on an opponent's turn. Ryle will draw us those cards, but it's going to ping each and every single one of our creatures for 1. Sometimes it's worth it to lose a couple of creatures to draw those cards, but other times we can just pump our creatures so that they don't die to Ryle. Then there's Chaotic Strike, which is kind of a strange card. We can only play it during combat after blockers are declared, and then we have to flip a coin for each and every single creature that we control. For the flips that we win, those creatures get +1/+1 until the end of the turn. For the flips that we lose, they don't. Again, we really don't care about that part. We mostly care that it draws us a card for each creature we control. Then there's Spark of Creativity, which won't draw us any cards, but it is going to exile the top card of our library for each creature we control. And we can cast those cards by paying for them until the end of the turn. So the spells in this tactic are our best draw spells in the deck, but there are some backup draw spells that are still pretty good in their own right. Let's check out these spells in tactic number 6, next day shipping. First up, we have Balduvian Rage, which serves a double purpose in this deck. By paying X and a red, we'll get to pump all of our attacking creatures by +X/+0, and then we'll get to draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep for each of those attacking creatures. Again, we want explosive turns where we can do a ton of damage at once, and Balduvian Rage does that, and it also helps us refill our hand next turn. Just a quick note with these cards, they say the next upkeep, not our next upkeep, so we will get to draw during our opponent's turns. Then there's Panic, which we can only play during combat after blockers are declared, and it says target creature can't block this turn. But the main thing we care about is that we get to draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep. Aleatory is basically the exact same thing as Chaotic Strike, where we get to flip coins, but the main thing we care about again is that we get to draw cards at the beginning of the next upkeep. And finally there's Telemtor's Edict, which we really only want to use in desperate situations. Telemtor's Edict is going to remove each and every single one of our creatures from the game, but we'll get to draw a card at the beginning of our next upkeep for each of those creatures. So we really only want to do this if we are desperate and need to draw cards, or if someone's going to wrath the board. It might seem like a strange include in this deck, but it has won me games before. Alright, so we've got a lot of creatures in play, we've drawn a ton of cards. What do we do now? It's time to go into tactic number 7, get pumped. With this deck, we want explosive turns where we can surprise people and kill them very quickly. As long as Zada's on the battlefield, Reckless Charge is going to give all of our creatures +3/+0 and haste until the end of the turn, and we can flash it back for 3. Borrowed Hostility can either give our creatures +3/+0 or First Strike until the end of the turn. Usually we're going to choose that first one. Then there's Titan Strength, which does double duty in this deck. It's going to give all of our creatures +3/+1 until the end of the turn, and we get to scry 1 for each and every single one of those creatures. Brute Force and Built to Smash will both give our creatures +3/+3 until the end of the turn. With Built to Smash though, this can only target creatures that are attacking, but if they are artifact creatures, then they get Trample in addition to the +3/+3. Then there's Rouse the Mob, which will give all of our creatures +2/+0 and Trample until the end of the turn. Rush of Adrenaline is slightly better in that it will give our creatures +2/+1 and Trample until the end of the turn. Then there's Brute Strength, which will give all of our creatures +3/+1 and Trample. And Invigorated Rampage will give them +4/+0 and Trample until the end of the turn. Then there's perhaps our biggest pump spell in the deck, Downhill Charge. Downhill Charge does cost 3, but we can sacrifice a mountain instead of paying its cost, which can come in handy. It's going to give all of our creatures +X/+0 until the end of the turn, where X is the number of mountains we control. Every single land in this deck but 1 is a mountain, so we're going to have plenty of mountains on the field to pump our creatures. Then there's Assault Strobe and Teamer Battle Rage, both of which will give our creature double strike until the end of the turn. And Teamer Battle Rage will also give them Trample until the end of the turn if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. So we've got all these pump spells, but sometimes just casting 1 or 2 at a time isn't enough. So what are we going to do? Let's go into tactic number 8, Seeing Red. In order to have the most explosive turn sometimes, we need more mana than just our lands or our mana dorks can produce. That's when we cast something like Battle Hymn. Battle Hymn's going to give us 1 red mana for each creature that we control. Most of the time we're going to have a ton of creatures out in the battlefield, so this is going to produce a ton of mana. We can use that mana to cast more creature spells, more pump spells, and more draw spells, so we can just keep this engine going. Then there's Dragon Rage, which is going to add red to our mana pool for each attacking creature that we control, and those attacking creatures are going to gain Fire Breathing. This card might be a little more situational than Battle Hymn, but it's still very effective, especially since we're going to be attacking a lot with this deck. Then we have what can be the biggest ritual for this deck with Inner Fire. Inner Fire is going to add red to our mana pool for each card in our hand. Again, with this deck we are drawing a ton of cards at once, and if we hit a couple draw spells in a row, we can have upwards of 30 or 40 cards in our hand at once. Then when we cast Inner Fire, it's going to add a ton of mana to our mana pool and allow us to cast pretty much any and every single card that we want to cast. Unless our opponents have some tricks up their sleeves, it's going to be very hard for them to stop us once we get that much mana. Speaking of a lot of mana, we're also running Mana Geyser in this deck. Mana Geyser is going to add red to our mana pool for each tapped land our opponents control. In the right situation, this card can even produce more mana than Inner Fire. The later the game goes, the better this card gets. Alright, so we can either produce a ton of mana and cast all our stuff, or we can just cast some of our stuff for free. Let's go into tactic number 9, Free Lunch. First we have Dualcaster Mage, which is incredible in this deck. Dualcaster Mage has Flash, and when it enters the battlefield we get to copy target instant or sorcery spell, and then we can choose new targets for that copy. Now unfortunately, if we target Zada with that copy, it doesn't actually trigger Zada's ability and target the rest of our creatures. This is because it's just a copy, and it's not a spell that we actually cast. Now while it is nice that we do get to copy that one spell, the real reason that Dualcaster Mage is in this deck is because there's an infinite combo with it. The combo works with Dualcaster Mage in either Twin Flame or Heat Shimmer. If you remember from earlier, Twin Flame and Heat Shimmer are the ones that create copies of our creatures. So first we need to cast Twin Flame targeting one of our creatures. While it's on the stack and before it resolves, we're going to cast Dualcaster Mage targeting Twin Flame. We now have a copy of Twin Flame and we can choose a new target for it, so we're going to choose Dualcaster Mage. The copy of Dualcaster Mage is going to come in, and then we can copy the original Twin Flame that's still on the stack. This is going to create another copy of Twin Flame, and so on and so forth. The end result is that we're going to have an infinite number of Dualcaster Mage tokens with haste on the battlefield, and we can swing out and win the game. While this combo is pretty sweet, I still think that this next card is better for the deck. And that's why the golden pig for this deck is going to be Kari Zev's Expertise. Kari Zev's Expertise is a sorcery that costs 1 red, and it says gain control of target creature or vehicle until the end of the turn, untap it, it gains haste until the end of the turn, and you may cast a card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Now at face value this might seem like a strange include for this deck. We don't really want to gain control of other people's creatures, that's not what we're really about with this deck. What we do want to do, however, is cast a ton of free cheap spells. So we're going to target Zada with Kari Zev's Expertise, and it's going to copy for each creature we control. We're going to untap all of those creatures, they gain haste until the end of the turn, that's great, but what we really care about is that we get to cast a card with converted mana cost 2 or less from our hand without paying its mana cost for each creature we control on the battlefield. That means that if we have 10 creatures on the battlefield, we get to cast 10 spells from our hand that cost 2 or less for free. Now you might be thinking, well I probably don't have 10 cards in my hand. Well, that's where all of our draw spells come in. The majority of our draw spells cost 2 mana or less. With that first cast of Kari Zev's Expertise, we can cast one of those draw spells for free and draw a ton of cards. This can draw us into more draw spells, pump spells, or even something like Battle Hymn that will add a ton of mana to our mana pool. With the right setup and just a draw spell in our hand, casting Kari Zev's Expertise can win us the game. It is by far the most explosive card in our deck, and that's why it earned the title of the Golden Pig. Next up we have a card that's not quite as explosive, but is still very good in its own right. It's Goblin Dark Dwellers. When Goblin Dark Dwellers enters the battlefield, we can cast an instant or sorcery with converted mana cost of 3 or less from our graveyard without paying its mana cost. This card is especially good when we can copy it with something like Twin Flame or Heat Shimmer. The more free spells that we can cast in this deck, the better. So we've talked about how we can cast a ton of cards, pump our creatures, and swing for a huge amount of damage. But there are some times we can't win with combat damage alone, so let's go on to tactic number 10, the Grand Finale. We're going to be running Impact Tremors, which is an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. Since there are a ton of creatures and creature tokens that come into play with this deck, we will be pinging our opponents constantly with this card. And if we go infinite with Dualcaster Mage, that's just the end of the game for everyone else. Then there's Soulsfire, which says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. When we can't get our combat damage through, this can finish our opponents off by just having our creatures directly deal damage to our opponents. As you can see, this deck is extremely explosive, and it's one of my favorite decks to pilot. But now that you've seen all the cards that help you win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. We are going to be running a total of 34 lands, and like I mentioned earlier, we are only running one non-basic. Foundry of the Consoles taps for a colorless, and we can pay 5 and tap to sacrifice it to put 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying into play. This land can come in really handy by helping us put some extra bodies onto the battlefield. And then we are running 33 mountains. It's important for this deck to be as fast as it can, so having lands that come into play untapped is huge. Now that we've gone through every single card in the deck, let's do a quick price check. Our deck costs are calculated using TCG Player optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Zada EDH rec deck is going to set you back about $110.45. Let's see how we compare. Our deck is much more affordable and comes in just under budget at $14.98. Again, our Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within our budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. Let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. Reliquary Tower comes in at $1.42. Reliquary Tower is a land that taps for a colorless and gives us no maximum hand size. This would be a great addition to the deck to prevent us from having to discard at the end of our turn when we draw a ton of cards. Kerkeep is another great addition to the deck, and it's only going to cost you $1.74. Kerkeep is a legendary land that taps for a colorless and also has 1 in a red, tap it, put a 0/1 red kobold creature token into play. With this deck, we want as many creatures out as quickly as possible, so having a land that can help us do this is huge. Then there's Ruby Medallion that comes in at $5.49. Ruby Medallion is an artifact that costs 2 and says red spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This card would go great in our deck, allowing us to cast our spells faster and to cast more spells in a turn. Next up is Goblin Rabblemaster, coming in at $2.99. Goblin Rabblemaster is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior that costs 2 in a red. He has other Goblin creatures you control attack each turn if able. At the beginning of combat, on your turn, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token with haste, and whenever Goblin Rabblemaster attacks, it gets +1/+0 until the end of the turn for each other attacking Goblin. We are going to be attacking a ton with this deck anyway, so the first part doesn't really affect us too much. The part that we really like about this card, though, is that we get that 1/1 red Goblin each turn. Another Goblin that would be a good addition to this deck is Krenko Mob Boss, who comes in at $1.89. Krenko Mob Boss is a 3/3 Goblin Warrior that costs 2 red. When we tap him, we get to create X 1/1 red Goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins that we control. This deck runs a ton of Goblin spells, and we can just use Krenko to double the number of goblins that we control each turn. Finally, we've got Combat Celebrant, who comes in at $1.99. Combat Celebrant is a 4/1 human warrior that costs 2 in a red. He has, if Combat Celebrant hasn't been exerted this turn, you may exert it as it attacks. When you do, untap all other creatures you control, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Getting this additional combat phase can be huge for our deck. There are times where if we just had another attack with our pumped up creatures, we would win. And Combat Celebrant gives us that opportunity by allowing us to attack again. And with that, our show is coming to a close. But I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me know what you think about this deck. Is there anything that you would add or take out, or something that I missed in the reasonable upgrades? I'd love to hear it all, so why don't you either comment below or reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. In the description below, you'll find those links to Twitter and Facebook, as well as a link to this deck list. Also in the description below, you'll find a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future Commanders for deck techs. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of our other deck techs. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.